It began on a quiet street lined with perfect lawns, where the grass was trimmed to an exact 2 inches and the mailboxes all matched in polished uniformity. The Maplewood Estates HOA took pride in this perfection, the kind of sterile beauty that made the neighborhood look like a catalog more than a home. At the end of Birch Lane stood Walter Briggs, a retired machinist in his late 60s. He had moved into Maplewood Estates 10 years ago after his wife, Margaret, passed away. The house was smaller than their old one, but it had a little garden patch she would have loved, filled with marigolds, tulips, and a small fountain that whispered under the morning sun. Walter wasn't the kind of man who cared much for HOA rules. He paid his dues, kept his yard neat, and minded his own business. But he also had a sense of humor, quiet, dry, and deeply personal. One spring morning, while browsing a roadside antique shop, he spotted a small stone gnome with a red cap and a mischievous grin. Something about it reminded him of his wife's sense of whimsy, her love for small, joyful things. Without hesitation, he bought it and placed it right beside the fountain in his yard. To him, it was a small tribute, harmless and endearing. The next day, he noticed something odd. A letter taped to his mailbox, the official Maplewood HOA logo printed at the top. It was a violation notice. The reason: unapproved decorative structure, lawn ornament, garden gnome, not in harmony with neighborhood aesthetic. Walter read it twice, his brow furrowed. A garden gnome? Unapproved? He looked around. His neighbor's yard had a 3-foot birdbath shaped like an angel. Across the street, the president of the HOA herself had ceramic ducks lining her walkway. How was his small gnome any different? But rules were rules, or at least that's what they always said. The HOA board, led by Marjorie Bell, had become notorious for enforcing arbitrary standards. She had once fined a family for painting their shutters the wrong shade of beige. To her, the neighborhood's appearance was sacred, a monument to her control. Walter, however, wasn't easily intimidated. He removed the gnome for the time being, but not out of fear. Instead, he placed it carefully on his back porch, where he could see it through the kitchen window. He sipped his morning coffee, staring at its smirk, and something inside him stirred, a mixture of sadness, mischief, and quiet defiance. A few days later, the HOA sent another letter, this one a friendly reminder about compliance. The tone was smug, self-congratulatory, as if they had already won. Walter read it slowly, then folded it neatly and set it beside the gnome. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the houses and the sprinklers hissed across the lawns, Walter went online. He started browsing garden decor websites, antique listings, and even local classifieds. The next morning, a delivery truck arrived, then another the following day. By the end of the week, 5 new gnomes stood proudly in his front yard. Each one had its own character. One fishing by the fountain, another sleeping under a mushroom, one holding a welcome sign, and 2 guarding the mailbox like sentinels. They were cheerful, harmless, and perfectly positioned. When Marjorie Bell drove by that Friday morning, her car screeched to a stop. Her jaw dropped. She pulled out her phone, snapping photos like she was documenting a crime scene. That evening, a new violation notice appeared in Walter's mailbox, this time thicker, printed in bold letters, with words like repeated non-compliance and disciplinary action. Walter didn't respond. He just smiled at the gnomes as he watered his tulips. The following week, a few neighbors began to notice the display. Some chuckled when they passed. Others took photos. One child pointed at the gnome fishing near the fountain and giggled, telling his mother it looked like Mr. Briggs. Slowly, the absurdity of the situation began to ripple through the neighborhood. Whispers of amusement mixed with irritation. The HOA called an emergency meeting. They discussed the gnome problem in serious tones, referring to it as a potential property value risk. Marjorie, red-faced and indignant, insisted that if the board didn't act decisively, other residents might follow Walter's example. One gnome, she warned, can lead to chaos. But not everyone agreed. A few members thought it was harmless, even charming. Still, Marjorie pushed forward, citing a clause buried deep in the HOA guidelines about unauthorized exterior decor. They voted 3-2 to issue a formal demand: remove all gnomes within 7 days or face daily fines. The next morning, Walter received the notice. He read it quietly, then walked outside. The sun was warm. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass, and the gnomes stared back at him, smiling. He looked at them for a long time, and a slow grin spread across his face. In that moment, something shifted. The petty control of the HOA, the constant policing of joy, it all became clear to him. They didn't want order, they wanted obedience. And that, Walter decided, was something he would never give them. The following day, the deliveries doubled. Boxes began arriving from all over, small ones, large ones, heavy crates labeled fragile. By the weekend, his yard was filled with nearly 20 gnomes. Some held lanterns that glowed at night. Others rode miniature animals or pushed tiny wheelbarrows. The neighborhood was buzzing. People stopped to stare. Cars slowed as they passed. Children laughed. Adults whispered, and Marjorie fumed. Walter's quiet rebellion had become a spectacle. But he wasn't finished, not by a long shot. This was only the beginning. The HOA wanted uniformity, and he was about to give them the most colorful chaos Maplewood Estates had ever seen. As the sun set behind the rows of perfect houses, Walter sat on his porch, watching the faint glow of the gnomes' lanterns flicker to life. His yard looked like a tiny, enchanted village, cheerful, defiant, and full of personality. The war between Walter Briggs and the Maplewood HOA had begun, and Walter was ready to fight it one gnome at a time. By the time the Walter didn't panic. He had been expecting this escalation. Instead, he took a slow breath, set the papers on his kitchen counter, and went back outside. That afternoon, a delivery truck pulled up once more. 2 men stepped out, wheeling a massive crate labeled Special Order. Walter signed for it, thanked them politely, and watched as they left. When he pried open the box, he couldn't help but chuckle. Inside stood a 4-foot-tall gnome, holding a shield and sword, its base engraved with the words, Defender of the Garden. He placed it right in the center of the yard, a towering sentinel among the smaller figures. By nightfall, lights twinkled around it. The gnome army looked like a tiny kingdom under the glow of garden lanterns. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The neighbors gathered quietly, snapping photos and whispering. Even those who once disapproved found themselves smiling. Across the street, Marjorie stood fuming behind her curtains. To her, this was open mockery, and she swore she wouldn't let it stand. She would file complaints, call lawyers, even alert the county if she had to. But what she didn't realize was that the more she pushed, the more united the neighborhood became. Not against Walter, but against her. For years, the HOA had ruled through fear and conformity. Now, Walter's garden had become a symbol of freedom, one that no fine or citation could silence. As the night deepened, Walter sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the glow of his gnome army. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't even nervous. He was simply amused by how far things had come. The HOA could fine him, threaten him, drag him to court, but they could never take back the laughter, the joy, or the quiet rebellion that now defined Birch Lane. Still, he knew the battle was only heating up. The HOA wouldn't back down easily, and neither would he. Weekend rolled around. Maplewood Estates no longer looked like the sterile, polished neighborhood it once was, at least not at the end of Birch Lane. Walter Briggs' home had transformed into a gnome paradise. The lawn that once held a single figure now hosted a full battalion of miniature guardians, each positioned with deliberate care. The neighbors couldn't help but take notice. Some found it hilarious. Others, particularly the self-proclaimed rule keepers, regarded it as a personal insult. Every morning, joggers slowed down to stare. Cars pulled over just to take photos. Children laughed and pointed as they passed, whispering stories about how the gnomes came alive at night. Walter watched it all with quiet satisfaction from his porch. His plan was simple, to make the HOA's rules look as ridiculous as they truly were. But what began as a small act of defiance was quickly becoming something much bigger. Marjorie Bell, the HOA president, was livid. She had always believed control equaled respect. Yet somehow, Walter's rebellion was making her look foolish. Every time she sent a violation notice, another gnome appeared. Every attempt to intimidate him only strengthened his resolve. At the HOA's next emergency meeting, she was practically seething. She held up photos of Walter's yard, each gnome labeled and numbered. "This," she declared, "is an infestation. It's visual pollution. It's an act of defiance against everything Maplewood Estates stands for." The board murmured uneasily. Some members were beginning to question Marjorie's obsession. The gnomes weren't harming anyone. In fact, the street had become more cheerful, attracting passers-by who never noticed the neighborhood before. But Marjorie refused to see charm. All she saw was chaos. She ordered official citations to be filed, daily fines, threats of lien, even the possibility of legal action. Yet each letter that arrived in Walter's mailbox went unanswered. He didn't pay a single cent, nor did he acknowledge the HOA's authority. Instead, he spent his time painting, repairing, and arranging new gnomes that arrived from online orders and local shops. By midweek, there were nearly 50. Each one was different. Some were reading books, others riding snails, or tending flowers. A few even resembled caricatures of the HOA board members, though Walter never admitted that out loud. One in particular, placed right at the center of the yard, bore an uncanny resemblance to Marjorie herself. Stern expression, clipboard in hand, and a tiny sash that read HOA Queen. Word spread fast. Photos of Walter's gnome army made their way onto social media. The post went viral in local groups. Man rebels against HOA by building gnome army. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive. Strangers called him a hero. A few even mailed him gnomes as gifts. Within days, the packages multiplied. Dozens arrived from across the country, each one accompanied by a handwritten note. For the cause, fight the HOA, from one rebel to another. Walter's lawn was no longer just a quiet protest. It was becoming a movement. Neighbors began to take sides. Some joined in, placing small decorations of their own. Birdhouses, colorful wind chimes, and even a few gnomes appeared in other yards. The street, once identical in its monotony, began to bloom with individuality. But not everyone was pleased. Marjorie doubled down. She started walking the street twice a day, taking photos and muttering under her breath. She left printed warnings on doors, reminding residents of decorative restrictions. But the more she enforced, the more people resisted. Even the mildest homeowners, who had once followed every rule without question, started questioning why a cheerful decoration could cause such turmoil. One night, under the faint light of his porch lamp, Walter stood among his growing army. He had started naming them, not out of sentimentality, but as a small act of humor. There was Norman the fisherman, Betty the baker, General Grin the leader of the Gnome Brigade, and of course, Marjorie the miniature, standing front and center with her clipboard of tyranny. He thought about how Margaret would have laughed at all this. She had always encouraged him to find joy in the absurd. And this battle of pettiness and pride was absurd in every possible way. Still, Walter knew it wasn't over. He expected retaliation, and he wasn't wrong. A few days later, he received a thick envelope by certified mail. Inside was a formal notice of legal action from the HOA. They were threatening to take him to small claims court for violating community standards and refusing to pay accumulated fines. The total amount listed at the bottom was over $3,000. The next few weeks were like a chess match between Walter Briggs and the Maplewood Estates HOA. Every move he made was countered by an increasingly desperate response from Marjorie Bell. She had declared it her mission to restore order, a phrase that had become almost comical among the residents who were now quietly rooting for Walter's defiance. But Marjorie was not one to admit defeat. To her, Walter wasn't just a stubborn old man. He was a contagion, a threat to the tightly controlled image of the community she had curated for years. His lawn, with its growing gnome army, stood as an open challenge to everything the HOA represented. She began escalating her efforts with a precision born of obsession. The first strike came in the form of relentless paperwork. Every few days, Walter received new citations, each one referencing obscure clauses from the HOA bylaws. Some accused him of unauthorized yard art, others of unsightly displays. One even claimed his decorations posed a safety hazard to neighborhood children. Walter barely read them anymore. He kept each letter in a growing pile on his dining table, right next to a stack of Gnome catalogs. Then came the second strike, intimidation through inspection. The HOA hired a compliance officer to drive through the neighborhood twice a day, stopping in front of Walter's house to take pictures. It was meant to make him uncomfortable, but Walter simply waved from his porch, smiling as if posing for a magazine shoot. The photos, however, began circulating beyond Maplewood. The story of the Gnome War had caught the attention of local news outlets. A small online article titled "Retiree Battles HOA Over Garden Gnomes" quickly gained traction, sparking debates about property rights and overreaching homeowner associations. Soon, reporters were calling for interviews. One afternoon, a camera crew parked outside Walter's home. They filmed the rows of gnomes lined neatly along his walkway, the towering 4-foot sentinel standing proudly at the center, and the cheerful signs scattered throughout the yard. Gnome's sweet gnome, free the garden, and respect your elders and their lawns. Marjorie's fury reached new heights. She accused Walter of publicly humiliating the HOA. She sent urgent emails to the board, demanding immediate legal intervention. She even tried to enforce an emergency amendment banning all unapproved decorative figures, but several board members pushed back, weary of the backlash. The HOA was fracturing from within. While Marjorie raged, others saw Walter's stand as a necessary wake-up call. They had grown tired of the endless rules, the constant surveillance, and the petty fines. For the first time, someone had stood up, and instead of chaos, the result was laughter, unity, and renewed community spirit. Still, Marjorie refused to relent. The next escalation came with a legal notice, a formal summons to small claims court. The HOA demanded payment of accrued fines and the immediate removal of all gnomes within 15 days. Failure to comply, they warned, would result in additional penalties and possible foreclosure action. Walter received the letter on a gray Monday morning. He stood by his mailbox, reading the words slowly, then folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. He wasn't afraid. He had been through worse. The loss of his wife, his retirement struggles, the long, lonely years that followed. Compared to those, this was nothing more than a game. A ridiculous, rule-filled game being played by people who mistook control for community. He decided then that he would not only fight, but make the fight unforgettable. That week, he began constructing something new. In his garage, surrounded by half-finished gnomes and boxes of supplies, he began assembling what would soon become the centerpiece of his rebellion, a massive wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Gnomeville, a community that cares." It stood 8 feet tall, hand-painted in bright colors, with cartoonish flowers and smiling gnomes framing the message. Beneath it, he placed a smaller sign with a single line, established in defiance of tyranny. By the time he finished, word had already spread through the neighborhood. Curious residents gathered on the sidewalk as he unveiled it. Some clapped, others cheered quietly. For many, it was the first time they had seen their street so alive with energy. Marjorie, of course, was apoplectic. She arrived minutes later, clipboard in hand, snapping photos and muttering furiously under her breath. Her anger boiled over when she realized people were actually enjoying the display. To her horror, a few neighbors even began adding gnomes of their own. Tiny ones peeked from flower beds, stoic ones guarded porches, and some homes hung small banners that read, "We stand with Gnomeville." What had started as one man's rebellion had become a neighborhood-wide movement. Within a week, half the street had joined in. Children painted gnome rocks. Families posed for photos in front of Walter's yard. The HOA's carefully constructed image of uniform perfection was dissolving into a vibrant tapestry of individuality. Marjorie's control was slipping, and she knew it. She called for another emergency HOA meeting, the third in less than a month. This one was more heated than ever. Some board members questioned her tactics, arguing that the HOA was now the subject of ridicule. Others warned that continuing the fight could expose them to legal scrutiny, especially after the media attention. But Marjorie would hear none of it. She demanded that the board vote to authorize legal enforcement. When the vote came, it was split, half in her favor, half against. The deciding vote came from a young board member named Clara, who had joined only a few months earlier. Clara voted against enforcement. Marjorie slammed her papers shut and stormed out of the room, vowing to take matters into her own hands. The following morning, security cameras on Birch Lane recorded a familiar figure walking across Walter's lawn just before dawn. Dressed in a dark coat and carrying a flashlight, Marjorie Bell crept between the gnomes, muttering angrily. She bent down to pick one up, the HOA Queen Gnome, and tucked it under her arm. But what she didn't realize was that Walter had installed motion-activated floodlights and a security camera system just days earlier. The lights blazed on, illuminating her in full view. The camera blinked red as it captured everything: the trespassing, the theft, the expression of shock and panic on her face as she realized she'd been caught. She dropped the gnome and fled. By sunrise, the footage had already been backed up and shared with several neighbors. And within hours, it began circulating online. The HOA president, caught red-handed, trespassing, and attempting to steal from the very man she had been trying to punish. The war had taken a turn. And for the first time, Walter knew he wasn't just winning. He had already won the neighborhood's heart. The sun rose quietly over Maplewood Estates the next morning, but the air was already thick with rumor. By the time most residents had finished their morning coffee, the video had made its way into every neighborhood group chat, text thread, and social media feed in the community. There was clear as daylight HOA President Marjorie Bell sneaking across Walter Briggs' lawn in the early hours of the morning. The footage showed her bending down, flashlight in hand, reaching for the gnome that looked suspiciously like her. Then, the floodlights snapped on, freezing her mid-step like a deer caught in headlights. Her startled expression, the quick drop of the gnome, and her panic sprint off camera told the entire story in just 30 seconds. The clip was only a few seconds long, but it was devastating. By noon, the video had already gone viral in the surrounding suburbs. Local Facebook groups were flooded with comments. HOA president caught trespassing. This is what happens when power goes to your head. The gnome war continues. People who had never set foot in Maplewood Estates were suddenly fascinated by the ongoing feud. Some even drove by just to see the infamous Gnomeville for themselves. The once quiet cul-de-sac now buzzed with curious onlookers, laughter, and camera phones. For Walter, the chaos was strangely peaceful. He didn't gloat or taunt. He simply carried on tending to his garden as usual, greeting anyone who passed with a polite nod. His small act of resistance had turned into something far bigger, a movement that exposed not just one woman's ego, but an entire system's absurdity. Inside her house, however, Marjorie Bell was unraveling. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since sunrise. Some calls were from board members demanding an explanation, others from local reporters requesting comment. Even her family had seen the video. Her sister from out of state had left a voicemail, gently asking what on earth she'd been thinking. Marjorie couldn't escape the humiliation. The HOA email inbox was overflowing with complaints, not against Walter this time, but against her. Residents wanted answers. Why had she been on private property? Why had she acted without the board's consent? And most importantly, why was the HOA still harassing a man over something as harmless as lawn gnomes? That same day, Clara, the young board member who had voted against enforcement, called an emergency session. This time, it wasn't to discuss Walter's decorations. It was to address the president's misconduct. Marjorie didn't attend. The meeting was brief but decisive. By unanimous vote, Marjorie was suspended from her duties pending investigation. Her access to HOA records and funds was revoked immediately. The news spread through the neighborhood faster than any memo the HOA had ever sent. For the first time in years, Maplewood Estates was free from her grip. But even as the board distanced itself from her, Marjorie refused to go quietly. That evening, she posted a long statement on the community bulletin, claiming the footage was taken out of context. She insisted she had only been conducting an early morning inspection and that the incident was being exaggerated by certain individuals' intent on undermining the integrity of the HOA. No one believed her. The comments flooded in, mocking her excuses. Someone even posted a meme, a photo of a gnome holding a flashlight with the caption, "Marjorie, is that you?" It spread like wildfire. Meanwhile, Walter's home became the center of an unexpected celebration. Neighbors stopped by to thank him. Some brought food, others brought more gnomes, laughing as they added to the growing collection. What had once been a quiet rebellion had now become a symbol of community pride. Walter didn't seek recognition, but he couldn't deny the warmth it brought him. For years after his wife's passing, he had felt isolated, adrift in a sea of rules and routine. Now, for the first time, he felt alive again, surrounded by people who shared laughter, kindness, and a collective sense of victory. But despite the joy, he knew the battle wasn't quite over. A few days later, Walter received a certified letter, not from Marjorie this time, but from the HOA's legal representative. It was an apology. The letter acknowledged that the citations against him were being withdrawn and that the board had voted to suspend all decorative restrictions pending review. They even offered to reimburse him for any fines previously issued. It was in essence a surrender. Walter smiled as he read it. He folded the letter carefully and pinned it to the gnome that resembled Marjorie, right between its tiny hands, as if it were holding its own resignation. That gesture alone became another viral moment. Someone snapped a photo and posted it online, "Victory in Gnomeville." The image spread almost as quickly as the original video. Local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a modern-day David versus Goliath tale, one man's stand against bureaucratic overreach. Reporters began calling again, and this time Walter agreed to a short interview. Standing in his yard, surrounded by his hundreds of gnomes, he simply said that all he ever wanted was to be left alone to enjoy his home. "Life's too short," he explained, "to let anyone else tell you how to decorate your garden." The clip aired on local TV, drawing laughter and applause from viewers across the state. He didn't realize it at the time, but his words would echo far beyond Maplewood Estates. In the days that followed, other communities reached out, sharing similar stories of HOA overreach. Some even started their own small acts of rebellion. Birdhouses painted in wild colors, pink flamingos arranged in protest lines, or tiny gnomes standing guard on porches. The Gnome Rebellion, as people began calling it online, became a viral trend. Back in Maplewood, peace finally settled over Birch Lane. The constant patrols stopped. The notices ceased. The laughter returned. The gnomes, once symbols of defiance, now stood as cheerful reminders of a community that had learned to stand together. But while most celebrated, one person remained consumed by resentment. In her darkened home at the end of the block, Marjorie watched the coverage in silent fury. The same neighborhood that once bowed to her authority now mocked her name. The HOA she built had turned against her. Her leadership, her reputation, her pride, all undone by a single camera and a yard full of painted clay. She couldn't stand it. She couldn't let it end like this. As the neighborhood moved on, Marjorie began plotting her next move. If she couldn't win by rules, she would find another way. And this time, she planned to strike where Walter least expected. Because while the community thought the war was over, Marjorie Bell wasn't finished fighting yet. The weeks following the scandal brought a strange calm to Maplewood Estates. The Gnome Army stood proudly in Walter Briggs' yard. The laughter of children replaced the anxious whispers that once filled the cul-de-sac, and the HOA board, now under Clara's steady leadership, had started rewriting its outdated rules to allow reasonable personal expression. For most residents, it felt like peace had finally returned. But peace was not what Marjorie Bell wanted. Publicly, She had gone quiet. She stopped attending meetings, stopped sending memos, and even stopped walking her usual patrol route with her clipboard. Neighbors assumed she was humiliated into silence, licking her wounds behind closed curtains. But in truth, she was plotting. The loss had consumed her. The viral video, the memes, the laughter, it all gnawed at her pride. For years, she had built her identity around being the enforcer, the one who kept Maplewood beautiful and orderly. Now, she had become a punchline. The HOA was functioning without her, and worse, people were happier for it. In her mind, it wasn't justice, it was betrayal. Marjorie began spending long evenings in her home office, poring over old HOA documents, zoning regulations, and county ordinances. If she couldn't win under the HOA's banner, perhaps she could use the law itself. There had to be a loophole, some technicality that could make Walter's gnomes illegal again. After days of obsessive searching, she found it. A clause buried deep in the county's property maintenance code regarding obstructions visible from public right-of-way exceeding allowable quantity. The wording was vague, but Marjorie believed she could use it. All she needed was the right complaint to trigger an inspection. The following week, she called the county office under an alias, reporting a visual nuisance and potential safety hazard at a residence on Birch Lane. She described hundreds of unsecured ceramic figures that could pose a tripping risk or attract vandalism. Her tone was professional, her words carefully chosen. 2 days later, a county vehicle arrived. Walter was pruning his roses when he noticed a man step out of a white car, clipboard in hand. The inspector introduced himself politely and explained there had been a complaint about yard clutter. Walter sighed, but cooperated, walking him through the property. The man took photos, measured distances, and scribbled notes. He seemed almost apologetic, clearly aware of who Walter was and what the gnomes represented. Before leaving, he admitted the complaint seemed exaggerated, but policy required documentation. Walter thanked him and didn't think much of it. But Marjorie, watching from her window across the street, smiled. Her plan was working. Within a week, Walter received a formal county notice citing him for excessive decorative installations visible from the public right-of-way. It demanded he reduce his yard display to no more than 20 items within 30 days or face escalating fines. It wasn't from the HOA, it was from the county itself. For the first time since the feud began, Walter felt a pang of worry. This wasn't a petty HOA rule he could mock or ignore. This was a legal citation. If he refused to comply, the fines could accumulate, and eventually enforcement could escalate. Still, he wasn't about to surrender easily. He spent the next few days reviewing the notice, reading through every line, searching for inconsistencies. And as he did, he found something curious. The clause cited in the complaint didn't actually apply to private yards unless the items obstructed the sidewalk or extended into public property. None of his gnomes did. It was a small loophole, but a powerful one. Walter gathered his evidence and submitted a formal appeal. He also reached out to a local news reporter who had covered the earlier story, explaining what was happening. Within days, another article appeared online. HOA president behind county complaint in Gnome war. Escalation? The piece didn't name Marjorie directly, but it didn't have to. Everyone knew. The backlash was immediate. Neighbors were outraged that she had taken her feud beyond the HOA, weaponizing the county government against a harmless retiree. Even the board condemned her actions, calling them vindictive and unauthorized. Marjorie's name became synonymous with overreach. But she refused to back down. She doubled down instead. Anonymous letters began appearing in mailboxes, printed rants about neighborhood decay and disrespect for standards. The style was unmistakable. Everyone knew they came from her. The more she fought, the worse it became. The county inspector, realizing he'd been manipulated into a personal vendetta, officially withdrew the citation. The appeal was closed in Walter's favor. The gnomes stayed exactly where they were, and the ruling even clarified that non-commercial decorative displays were protected as personal expression. Marjorie's last weapon had backfired completely. When the news broke, the neighborhood erupted in celebration. People gathered in Walter's yard, laughing and cheering. Someone brought balloons. Another neighbor brought cake. Children placed new gnomes around the edges of his garden, miniature versions they had painted themselves. The local paper ran the headline, "Gnomeville triumphs again." Walter, though grateful, remained humble. He smiled, thanked everyone, and quietly returned to tending his flowers. The gnomes stood gleaming in the sunlight, each one a silent reminder of resilience and humor. Across the street, Marjorie watched from behind her curtains. Her face was pale, her eyes tired. The laughter outside pierced her like a blade. The community she had once ruled now celebrated her downfall openly. She realized then that she wasn't just losing a battle, she had lost her purpose. For years, the HOA had given her identity, structure, and control. Now, she was just another resident in a neighborhood that no longer feared her. And in that loss of control, something inside her began to crumble. She didn't show up to the next board meeting, or the one after that. Eventually, Clara received her resignation via email, a single line that read, "I'm done." The board accepted it without hesitation. Maplewood moved on. The new leadership focused on community spirit rather than control. The HOA's newsletter began featuring photos of residents' gardens, celebrating creativity instead of restricting it. And Walter, once the quiet widower at the end of Birch Lane, had become a local legend. Yet, even as the community thrived, he couldn't shake the feeling that Marjorie's story wasn't quite over. People like her rarely disappeared quietly. She had retreated, yes, but retreat wasn't the same as surrender. Sometimes, defeat only makes certain people more determined. And in the stillness of her home, surrounded by old files and bitterness, Marjorie Bell was quietly deciding what her final act would be. Autumn arrived early that year. The trees along Birch Lane turned golden and began shedding their leaves, covering the sidewalks like confetti. The air smelled faintly of rain and wood smoke, and for a moment, Maplewood Estates seemed almost idyllic again, a neighborhood reborn from its own chaos. Walter Briggs' yard remained the centerpiece. What began as a rebellion had evolved into art. Each gnome had its place, forming rows like a tiny army at attention. Some were painted by children, others sculpted by local artists. What once symbolized defiance had become a symbol of unity, the moment the neighborhood stopped being afraid to be itself. But deep inside her two-story house, Marjorie Bell was not at peace. Since her resignation, she had withdrawn completely from the community. Her blinds were always closed. The once pristine lawn she used to manicure obsessively had grown wild at the edges. Even her mail piled up on the porch. She was a ghost in her own neighborhood, and yet she watched. Every day, she peeked through the curtain at Walter's yard. The laughter, the color, the easy camaraderie, it all burned her. In her mind, the gnomes were no longer cute decorations. They were trophies of her defeat, mocking her failure. Each smiling ceramic face seemed to whisper that she had lost control. And Marjorie Bell did not lose gracefully. Her bitterness festered until it became obsession. She began keeping a notebook, a ledger of what she called infractions. Tall grass here, improper trash cans there, dogs barking past curfew. Every detail recorded meticulously, as if she were still the HOA president. It was as though she believed that if she kept order on paper, she could somehow reclaim her authority. Then one night she snapped. It was late, nearly midnight, when the rain began to fall. The street was quiet, save for the rhythmic drip from the gutters. Marjorie slipped outside wearing a dark raincoat, carrying something small and heavy wrapped in cloth. Her hands trembled as she crossed the street toward Walter's yard. The gnomes stood silently in the drizzle, their painted faces glistening in the faint glow of a street lamp. Marjorie knelt near the edge of the lawn and carefully placed something in the soil, a new gnome. Smaller than the others, freshly painted, its smile twisted just slightly too wide. She positioned it facing the street, directly at Walter's front door, and whispered something under her breath before retreating into the shadows. By morning, it was gone. When Walter stepped outside the next day, he noticed the fresh patch of mud where something had been placed. He found faint footprints leading away, but no sign of what had been there. He shrugged it off, assuming it was a child playing a prank. But that night, it happened again. Another gnome appeared, this one near the driveway. Its hat was bright red, its eyes oddly sharp. A small piece of paper was tucked beneath it. Walter bent down and unfolded it. In neat, shaky handwriting, it read, "Order must be restored." Walter froze. The message didn't frighten him as much as it saddened him. He knew instantly who had left it. It was unmistakably Marjorie's handwriting. He'd seen it on countless HOA notices over the years. He didn't tell anyone. Instead, he quietly moved the gnome to the far end of the yard, near the fence where it blended with the others. He didn't want to humiliate her again. Deep down, he felt pity. She was a lonely woman grasping for relevance in a world that had moved on. But the incidents continued. Every few nights, another gnome would appear. Some carried notes with phrases like "standards matter" or "chaos breeds decline." Others bore silent, eerie expressions, eyes slightly off, painted hands clasped as if praying. The neighbors began whispering again, uneasy now. Cameras were installed. Porch lights stayed on. Yet somehow, the mysterious gnomes kept showing up. Then, one morning, Marjorie's house stood empty. Her car was gone. The curtains were open for the first time in months, revealing a barren living room. Neighbors knocked, but no one answered. Eventually, a for sale sign appeared in the yard, posted by an out-of-town real estate agent. Rumors spread that she had moved in with a relative in another state. The tension eased. The strange gnome deliveries stopped. Life slowly returned to normal. A month later, Walter decided to honor the end of it all. He planned one final addition to his collection, a single gnome, painted gold, holding a miniature scroll that read "Peace at Last." It was meant as a closing chapter, a symbol of forgiveness and finality. He placed it at the center of his garden, surrounded by flowers. The neighbors gathered to watch, smiling as Walter carefully set the gnome in its spot. For the first time in years, Birch Lane felt completely at peace. But that night, as the street fell quiet, the wind stirred through the yards, rustling leaves and shifting shadows. And there, under the faint glow of a street lamp, one more gnome appeared beside the golden one, small, simple, and painted in dull gray. Its face was familiar. Sharp chin, thin lips, eyes that looked almost judgmental. It was unmistakably modeled after Marjorie Bell. No one ever confessed to making it. Some said a neighbor added it as a joke. Others whispered that Marjorie had left it there herself before leaving town. Her final mark on the street she once ruled. Walter never confirmed either way. He simply left it there, standing among the rest. Over time, the golden gnome and the gray gnome came to represent two sides of Maplewood's history: defiance and control, humor and order, freedom and restraint. The neighborhood grew around them, stronger and kinder for having survived both. Years later, people still drove by just to see the yard where a war of wills had turned into a symbol of community. And under the morning sun, the gnome army stood unbroken, smiling, eternal, and quietly victorious.